Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest.
A very big welcome to Tessa Clark today, who is the visionary CEO of Olio. She's got a background in digital leadership and startup ventures, and Tessa excels in driving change and aligning teams around that shared vision. And her passion for sustainability, which was ignited by her farming roots, led her to found Olio in 2015, which is a platform dedicated to fighting food waste and promoting a circular economy. Now, if you haven't already had a look at Olio, it's such a wonderful idea. I've used it several times, and I think that the way that it brings the community together to reduce food waste is something that's really, really important. So join us as we explore Tessa's inspiring journey, her mission to make a lasting impact on the world, and her insights about leadership and self-awareness. Tessa, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you're a leader of a groundbreaking movement in reducing food waste. But what kind of leadership skills did you have to nurture to get here? Because an organization like yours doesn't just happen overnight.
No, it doesn't. And I'd say the first skill that I had to nurture was actually courage, because it really does take quite a lot of courage to leave your corporate role, leave that career that looks great on paper and take that leap out into the unknown, into entrepreneurship. And also being a female entrepreneur, a female startup founder, there really weren't that many role models that I could look to. And so it actually took me quite a long time before I was able to have sufficient courage to kind of take that leap. I do think that having a co-founder in Sasha really helped give me that courage. So you've got to have courage to take that first step, but then everything sort of on the journey is about learning new things. So you're constantly having to kind of push yourself. So courage is definitely the first thing. I think the other leadership skill that I really had to grapple with very early on in the Olio journey is actually humility, because I was pretty senior in my corporate career, and I was used to being in an environment where I knew the answers to most things. And as the leader, you were expected to have the answer to most things. Whereas when you're setting out on this voyage into the unknown, you very quickly realize that loads of people are going to ask you questions, and you don't actually yet know the answer to most of those questions. So I had to get comfortable with acknowledging what I didn't know, but then resolving to sort of set about and learning about it as quickly as possible. So the third thing really is the growth mindset. That's something you have to embrace in spades, I think, to lead a startup. And then the fourth leadership skill, I would say, really was around storytelling, because you have to persuade other people to join you on your mission, whether that be your first hires or investors or the media. So you really have got to sort of work very, very hard and perfect the art of storytelling.
How interesting. And I'm conscious that Olio is 10 years old next year. If I'd have asked you that question 5 years, 7 years ago, do you think your answers would have been the same? Or is this something that it's emerged that these are the important leadership skills for you over time?
Actually, I'd say they became fairly obvious fairly quickly. When you come sort of grinding up against the reality of trying to magic something up out of thin air, you very quickly learn that you've got to show up every day, be courageous. You've got to have humility. You've got to be constantly pushing yourself to learn more. And then you've got to be able to package that all up with the language and the storytelling. So no, I think that it became pretty immediately apparent. But there's certainly things that courage would have been obvious to me before founding Olio, but the other three weren't necessarily obvious to me before founding Olio.
Oh, so it's definitely been a learning journey and quite a steep one.
Yes.
So tell us about Olio.
So Olio is an app that exists to help solve the climate crisis by tackling the enormous problem of waste, specifically in our homes and local communities. And how we do that is we connect people with their neighbours so they can give away rather than throw away their spare food and other household items. We also have over 100,000 volunteers who will collect unsold food at the end of the day from local businesses such as supermarkets or a corporate canteen. They will take that food home, add it to the app, and then their neighbours will request it and pop round and pick it up. So everything on Olio is about circular living, sustainable living. It's about community, and it's about making sure that the world's most precious resources are used rather than thrown away. And here in the UK, we've got about 4 million people have joined Olio. Globally, we've had 8 million people join Olio in total. Wow. And each month, we've got about 5 million items are being successfully shared via the platform.
God, that is just amazing. And that reach is just quite phenomenal.
Well, we've still got a long way to go, but yes.
Indeed. But congratulations, that really is making a huge impact in everyday lives, and it comes into my kitchen and it goes into other people's homes. As you say, it's neighbor to neighbor, and that is community building at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
So something that I'm interested in is the values of organizations, and people will have heard me say this before, that as managers we look down and in, and as leaders we look up and out. How then do you combine that leadership and management so that you really do live the values of Olio every day?
So I'm glad you asked about this, because values is something that we are really, really passionate about at Olio. So we've got a very, very clear mission. And the first thing we do is whenever we recruit not just for mission alignment, we recruit for mission obsession.
Oh,
and then
okay.
The second thing that we do is we recruit against our values. So we have 4 values. They are inclusive, resourceful, caring, and ambitious. And every person who interviews to join Olio has to, at some point in the journey, kind of present against those values. And we find that if you have a group of mission obsessed people who cut them and they bleed the same values, actually it means that the day-to-day living of the values is not that difficult. It's just very, very intuitive to people. Now, of course, we measure how well we're living against our values. We have an employee satisfaction survey, which we do twice a year, and we kind of rate ourselves on how well we're living our values. And that's always been an area, actually, we've done, relatively speaking, really well as an organisation. And we use our values to not only inform our recruitment processes, but we manage our 360 feedback according to our values. And we use our values on a day-to-day basis when we are trying to make business decisions. We look to our values to help us make the right decision.
I'm really interested in exploring that. I spoke to Chris Dyer because, as we often say, recruitment has got a lot to answer for. And when Chris Dyer and I were talking about this, how do you recruit to values? And I was interested that you're saying that people present to it or are able to talk to your values at some point during that process. Chris was talking to me about the challenge. I wouldn't go so far as to say danger. I think it's a challenge of how do you recruit to values whilst also ensuring that you have cognitive diversity in your organization and that you don't have groupthink, whereas, as you say, you have that mission is something that everybody is passionate about and obsessive about.
So, good question. I think we are living proof that you can recruit for mission and for values and still have enormous diversity of perspective and thought. And I guess maybe we're advantaged in this, in that our number one company value is inclusive. So we are very, very mindful in terms of how we recruit to make sure that we do get the full spectrum of humanity represented and working at Olio. As I sort of said, as part of the recruitment process, each person has to present. So there is a specific question in the presentation stage where you have to present against each of those 4 values. And we encourage people to use either examples from their professional lives and or examples from their personal lives. And it is very, very clear where someone authentically has a lot to say about that value and how it aligns with them as a human being. And you can sense other people are really having to kind of scrape the barrel a little bit to try and force fit themselves into that value. So it's a very, very effective mechanism for really kind of weeding people out. And then in terms of our diversity data, roughly kind of a third of the Olio team identify as neurodiverse. So we definitely have that diversity. We have also a similar amount are LGBTQ plus. Roughly a quarter of our team are from ethnic minority groups. Just under 60% of our team are female. So we have a very, very diverse team. And so we absolutely have not found that recruiting for values results in groupthink.
I think that's something that listeners and watchers will be really interested in finding more about, because I think generally this is a challenge for organizations. So maybe this is something that you would be able to talk more to them about if they're big organizations who are looking for advice and guidance as to how to do this well. They can certainly come to Olio and look at that model of really good practice. So we are interested in self-awareness and self-aware leadership specifically in this podcast. What does self-awareness mean to you?
Well, I was fascinated when you sent the question over, because I thought, gosh, that's a pretty deep question. And I went to a couple of places with that. The first, I think of self-awareness on sort of multiple levels. So the first level I just kind of call the meta level. And that's about having a degree of self-awareness about your role in the universe. And I find that quite grounding and centering and quite important. So on the one hand, I recognize that the fact that I exist or you exist is nothing short of a miracle. Trillions of things had to go right for that to happen. Yeah. So I kind of hold in my mind, wow, what an incredible privilege it is to be alive, to be a leader. On the other hand, I recognize that I'm a tiny, insignificant speck in the universe. And that's really a very, very kind of sobering thought as well. So I sort of use those two examples to keep me sort of quite balanced, just in terms of how I show up. You know, kind of not take myself too importantly, but similarly not completely thinking I'm irrelevant and unimportant and sort of I'm a victim. So that's the kind of meta self-awareness. I then think about self-awareness within the organization. And one thing certainly that I have learned a lot at Olio is the weight that you carry, that your words carry, that your actions carry, in particular as a founder of the business. And whilst that's sort of fairly obvious when you are the CEO of a large organization, you're kind of fairly used to that. It's actually more challenging, I would say, when you are a leader in a rapidly scaling organization, because you remember sort of in living memory when you were sort of in the trenches, shoulder by shoulder, working with everybody. So you think that you're just one of the gang, one of the team. But as the organization scales quite quickly, you have to recognize that your role needs to scale as quickly as well. And so it's really important to constantly remind yourself of just the undue weight that people apply to your words and your actions. And then the final level is about that sort of personal self-awareness. And for me, that's about having a really honest understanding of your strengths and your weaknesses and how you show up day after day in the workplace, and understanding what words people would use to describe you. For example, how you make people feel when they spend time with you. And that's something where 360 feedback, employee satisfaction surveys, all those sorts of things can be an invaluable source of insight and information, as well as your daily interactions.
Yeah, most definitely. Listeners, just to let you know, Tessa and I have not met before. However, Tessa have talked about two of the directions of my self-awareness compass already. We've talked about humility and behavior, which as listeners, watchers, you'll probably already know that it's modeling behavior is what particularly interests me. And we've talked about those two elements already without even talking about a compass.
I'm intrigued about the compass now, though.
Oh, right. It's in the book. It's in the book.
Okay.
So there's a 9-pointed compass, and it creates a mnemonic, which is CHARTABLE. It's chartable. So it's about being on the leadership journey, and each of those CHARTABLE, they have a particular element. So it's care, humility, adaptability, listening, etc. But you'll have to get the book to find out the rest.
Okay.
So tell us about any moments that you've had that have made you really question your leadership or explore your self-awareness. And I was interested in what you were saying about that speed of scaling up. You've got to learn pretty quickly about yourself and who you are and your branding on that journey, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say the first point at which I really started to question myself was at the very beginning of the journey. So I almost overnight went from being very senior in a large corporate environment and to the next day being, relatively speaking, kind of insignificant, just me and my co-founder trying to make change happen in the world. And that's a very humbling experience, because it makes you realize how many sort of trappings of power you get to benefit from when you exist in a corporate organization to kind of get stuff done. And suddenly that's all been nuked and you're back to just yourself and your wits and your abilities. Definitely kind of through the scaling journey, as I've already touched on. And then the other thing that I haven't touched on is I do spend a lot of time reflecting on gender, because we are a female co-founded business, and the tech world in which we operate, in particular the startup world, is very, very male dominated when it comes to funding, for example. Right. Female businesses just get 2% of all venture capital funding. Male founded businesses get 85%, and mixed teams get the delta. So we're operating in a world where the odds are really very much stacked against us. So I've spent probably too much time actually sort of double guessing and questioning myself and wondering, what would a man do in this situation? So I'm not sure if that's particularly healthy or not, but it is a reality of when I've been questioning my leadership and my leadership style.
Oh, interesting. So tell us about the moments that, what are those key things that you have learned about yourself on that journey? What if you had to sell yourself as the leadership brand of you, what would that be?
So several things. I think the first thing most people would say is passionate. So I've definitely got a lot of passion for our mission, definitely very high energy, extremely resilient, definitely will not give up at the first hurdle. And so we'll think very creatively, very laterally around how to solve problems. So I absolutely love working with the team and solving problems. I really enjoy that sort of dividing and conquering sense amongst a team. When a kind of a team gets into flow, you've got all the right people in the right places, and you've got that really high sense of trust and also autonomy. And I think that's something else that people say is very sort of symptomatic of my leadership style. I'm definitely not a micromanager. So whilst I can dive down into 10 millimeters of detail and then up to 10,000 feet, I don't enjoy micromanaging how people approach their work. I'll definitely challenge their work down at the 10 millimeter level, but I prefer sort of giving them a brief and then letting them sort of go off and run with that.
Is there something that you've identified, particularly when we're talking about the gender? I was interested what you said earlier about that there are more men in your entrepreneurial field than women. Something that I identified in my research was that people who work for women identify them as having greater self-awareness than men generally. What are you seeing in the men and the women that you are working with? Where does self-awareness sit in that gender divide?
Yeah, I mean, I always get a little apprehensive talking about gender because it makes it very black and white and very binary. Yep. And the reality is we're all on a spectrum. But I do a sort of somewhat similar question, which I'm going to twist slightly, and it hopefully will answer your question. But there's lots of data which shows that businesses run and led by women outperform businesses run and led by men. And I was always sort of very confused and perplexed by that. Much I'd like to say, women are just better. That doesn't kind of sit quite right with me. And then I saw some data fairly recently which said that women build more diverse teams. And more diverse teams outperform. I was like, aha, now I start to understand that. And then I asked myself, why are women building more diverse teams? And I think it is because as women, we are used to being outsiders. And if you're an outsider, I think you have a natural empathy with anyone else who would also consider themselves to be an outsider. And as an outsider, to make stuff happen, you've got to build collaborations and consensus and build momentum for what you want to do. And so by very definition, if you are an outsider, you can't just take a command and control approach to getting stuff done. So I think that is where that empathy piece comes from. You're only going to get so far doing command and control, you've got to build or flex that empathy muscle. You've got to get others on board and working with you. And I think quite naturally, you feel a lot of empathy for others who, like you, are battling against the status quo.
That's a fascinating perspective, and I think it's probably something I'm going to look into. It's probably something. There's probably a Harvard Business Review article on its way out that maybe is looking into that. So
there might be.
Yeah, very interesting.
Just my musings from various runs and stuff like that.
Do you think that the needs of your colleagues and your employees have changed over the last few years? And being that you're nearly 10 years old, you lived before COVID and now you're seeing the world beyond COVID, and I think COVID changed us all. Are you seeing that what your staff, your employees, your colleagues are asking of you, both as an organization and as a leader, is it changing?
Sort of yes and no. So Olio has always been a remote first business. So for us, COVID, whilst it had a huge personal impact on us in terms of the ways we worked and our professional relationships, it didn't have any impact on us at all. We didn't have an office that we all had to go home from, and we had designed all of our systems and our processes and our ways of communication to be remote first. I do kind of reflect on the culture we've built at Olio, but also the expectations of people when we're recruiting and bringing people in. And I do a bit of a compare and contrast of the conversations I'm having now as part of recruitment versus 10, 15, 20 years ago when I was recruiting a corporate career. And it is very, very clear to me that well-being, flexibility, and autonomy are topics that are really, really important to a growing number of people. And I sort of definitely believe, I think sort of myself and Sasha, one of our hallmarks of our leadership is our very passionate belief that everybody, not just the senior people, should have that sense of flexibility and autonomy and should have the ability to prioritize their personal well-being, even during the so-called working day. But that has definitely, and the whole conversation that we're having around mental health, I mean, just quite frankly, didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's definitely been a change sort of before Olio through to Olio. Then in terms of the requirements of our team, those requirements have mainly changed as things have happened in the business. For example, as we have gone through periods of rapid growth, and then also very sadly last year we had to retract in light of the challenging macroeconomic environment, and we did have to do restructurings for the first time last year, and that was the first time that it was an extremely difficult period to go through, and it was the first time we really created what I refer to as organizational scar tissue. And absolutely that is something that we are still having to deal with to this day. And then the only other thing I think that is sort of changing is as we're growing and as we're scaling, we are starting to recognize that whilst we're a remote first business, there are some functions within the business where there is a far higher degree of desire to connect in real life, and there are other functions that are really, really happy to be 100% remote first. And so we're just continuing to kind of work our way through this slightly remote first, but slightly hybrid-y model that we have of getting stuff done.
And I think I'm talking to more and more people who are seeing this, the organizational structure and the organizational culture, it's somewhere along a spectrum. It was either a very traditional, more industrial type organization, and now it's having to be hauled into post-COVID world, whereas you had the more modern organizations that were already sort of moving towards a modern way of working before COVID happened. And I think there is such a pull towards this change, and I can really see how people are on different points of that spectrum and that trajectory of change.
Yeah, we're a female co-founded business, and as I say, we were remote first before it was a thing. And actually it was our sort of dirty little secret, because pre-COVID, no one actually believed that we could build a successful business in this way. So Sasha and I stopped trying to persuade people that this is an incredibly effective model. And whenever people asked about our offices, we just sort of subtly changed the topic of conversation. But there are so many things. We often say that as female co-founders who between us had 40 years corporate career, we kept roughly half of what we consider to be the good stuff that we learned from our corporate backgrounds, but we happily jettisoned the other half, and we've really enjoyed creating a very modern business. So this kind of remote first way of working would be one example. Our holiday policy would be another. We have limitless holiday at Olio, but there's just one constraint there, which is that you must take off a minimum of 20 days to make sure that people are actually sort of sufficiently well rested. And there are lots and lots of other sort of smaller examples of how we are building Olio differently. And I think that's because we're coming at leadership from a different and from a female perspective.
Definitely. I'm interested in leadership at different levels of organizations, because traditionally, if you say leadership, people think of people at the most strategic end of organizations or right at the very top. As an organization that's really scaled quickly, and you will have seen these layers grow, what are your thoughts on people within organizations who are demonstrating leadership qualities at different levels? Are you seeing that? Is that something you're nurturing? How does it look in Olio?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because earlier on you talked about the delineation between managers versus leaders. Certainly all the organizations that I've worked at have been organizations that have been undergoing change. Not all of them, but most of them, because I'm attracted to change and to uncertainty. And when you're in an environment that does have a lot of change and uncertainty, or if you're growing very rapidly, then actually I personally think that that differentiation between leaders and managers is a bit of a false differentiation. And so certainly at Olio, I would consider all of us to be leaders of some way, shape or form. At the most micro level, a leader in terms of how we conduct ourselves, how we show up, how we collaborate with our colleagues, through to a team leader or a horizontal leader, all the way through to divisional leaders. But I want to create an environment where we really nurture the sense of leadership. And then I believe that you need to have the management sort of basics and hygiene factors in place. That's a prerequisite of being a leader. So we don't really sort of differentiate between those two roles in quite the same way that you might do if you were managing a very large corporate.
That's a helpful way of thinking about it, because in my mind, when I'm talking about management and leadership, I'm thinking of the functions. And I'll say that as individuals, sometimes we've got to manage, sometimes we've got to lead, and we've often got to do both. But yeah, I think that's far more helpful than that divide between managers and leaders, which whether it's a media ploy to generate some kind of conversation, I don't know. But I think talking about it in terms of management functions and leadership functions is probably far more helpful, because yes, I don't think we can split it. Certainly as when you work in organizations, you have to do a bit of both. Do you as a company support people to develop their self-awareness? So you talked about nurturing leadership skills. Where does self-awareness fit in that development program?
It's very timely that you should ask this question, because every Monday we have a company call. So it's a company all hands, everybody's on it. And last Monday we did a bite-sized L&D session on Radical Candor. So Radical Candor is a book and a concept and approach that we've really embraced at Olio. When people onboard, we give them a quick 101 on Radical Candor. And the reason why we focus on that so much is because we recognize that in a fast-moving, fast-growing organization, the only thing that's guaranteed is change, and change can often create friction. And unless you are all brilliant at giving and receiving feedback, it can be quite sort of counterproductive. And one of the biggest challenges that we have at Olio actually is that because we've got caring as one of our company values, there's a real risk that we can fall into the quadrant of ruinous empathy. We don't want to give people direct feedback because we care so deeply about them. We don't want to hurt them. So we're constantly reminding the team of the importance of Radical Candor. So that's one thing that we do. And so twice a year we do a formal 360 feedback process, but we also encourage people to be exercising Radical Candor on a weekly, if not daily basis. And then the other thing that we've got coming up soon, which I'm really excited about, is using the colours communication assessment tool. So the sort of the reds, the blues, the greens and the yellows. And I'm really looking forward to that because it's a tool that I've used before in my past, as has our people and culture director, and I've found that having that language can be very powerful in an organisation to help people understand one another, but also to explain themselves and their communication style. So they're just two examples of things that we are doing sort of right now to try and help people develop their self-awareness.
Tessa, there have been a couple of things that you've said today that I think other organisations really would want to tap into your good practice and your learning and your experience. Where would people go to find out not necessarily about what Olio does, but how you do it?
So I guess two places. The first would be, I do write blog posts on Medium, so I'm at Tessa L.F. Clarke, and there, for example, you can read about how we have built the organisation to be remote first from the bottom up. And another LinkedIn would be to find me on LinkedIn, again, Tessa Clarke, because I will share information to that effect. And then also on the careers page on the Olio website, which is olioapp.com, there's videos and commentary and materials, which I think give a real flavour as to how we approach these sorts of things.
Brilliant. I will make sure that everything that Tessa has just mentioned then is in the show notes for you to go and have a look at. Final question just before we let you go. What would be a key piece of advice that you would give somebody who is newly founding a company now?
So many pieces of advice, just a couple that I think are most pertinent for the earliest of days. The first one is to really, really, really focus on the problem that you're trying to solve and to forget about your idea. Because too many early stage founders think they've come up with an idea, they fall in love with their idea, but actually the reality is that's the wrong idea to solve the problem that the market has. Whereas what you need to do is really laser focus on what is the problem that the market has, and then you need to be really flexible and lateral and experiment a lot to figure out what the best solution or idea to that is. The second thing that I would absolutely highly recommend is reading a book called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Okay. It's been absolutely game-changing for myself. We ask everyone who joins Olio to read that book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's all about that sort of test, measure, and learn, taking that scientific and that experimental mindset to building not just your business, but building the culture of your business as well. And then the third and final thing I would say is to start small, do stuff that doesn't scale, and worry about the scaling piece further down the line when you get to it.
Absolutely brilliant. Lots to think about, lots to learn, lots for organizations to really consider where they are in that space, and to go to Medium, find out more, and read the book. We will make sure that all of those links are in the show notes for you. Tessa, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such an interesting conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled, delighted, and so excited to announce the launch of my book, The Self-Awareness Superhighway, Charting Your Leadership Journey. The book has got 3 parts. Part 1, Why Are You Here, Traveller, which is all about defining and describing self-awareness, leader effectiveness, and leadership at all levels, and setting out why it's important to you, the reader, me, and us. Part 2, Where Are You Going, sets out the 9 directions of the self-awareness compass. The 9 chartable compass points cover things like care, humility, authenticity, and reflection. And chartable is a mnemonic, CHARTABLE. Part 2 also explores the signposts and directions that enable you, and the roadblocks and trip hazards that obstruct you on your journey during your working life. Part 3, How Will You Get There? This describes the variety of tools, techniques, and methods that I've come across during my exploration of self-aware leadership that you can use to develop your self-aware leadership skills. And it covers things like mindfulness, journaling, coaching, and 360-degree assessments. I've dedicated my book to those who want to care better for others and those who want to be better cared for by others. I think it's going to be of most interest to people who manage people and have a desire to improve their leadership and management practices. And I also think that it's going to be of interest to people who've been led by poor leaders and people who want to know how they can in turn be better and do better than the people that have managed them. Please remember to leave a rate and review on Amazon, because rates and reviews influence rankings. And the higher my book goes in the rankings, the more chance we have of developing self-aware leaders and self-aware workplaces.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.